Welcome to Global Polarity. I'm your host, Dr. Digby James Wren. Today's podcast is an update on Donald Trump's Taco Tuesday. I'm calling it Taco Tuesday. He's back down again. Yesterday's podcast was done for the chair on Substack, also available on Spotify and YouTube if you can check that out. Have a look at that. Just put my name in and you'll find it, or I'll put the link in the bottom of this one. And so this podcast is just to update that. So clearly he has done a taco on us, and it's for very real reasons. So the first reason, of course, is that the Iranians said they haven't spoken to him and they're not going to speak to him. And my feeling, of course, is that's true, that he has just gone ahead and made this up. However, some of my colleagues in my network have suggested or even read some suggestions that actually there were some discussions with Russia and they acted as the intermediary. Whether this is true or not, I can't verify that at this time. But look, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because he had to back down. If he did escalate more, and one of those desalination plants in Saudi Arabia or UAE were wiped out, well, that would cause enormous amounts of grief. And the other thing is the Americans are not capable of launching a ground war in Asia and winning it. And that would take months and months to even get to the point. Gulf War I, it took 6 months to get everything in place for Iraq. Gulf War II, it took a very long time. So Gulf War II, and he's already backed down. Okay, so what's going to happen next? So now there's the coalition of the willing, if you like, Australia, UK, the Europeans. They're all back in, and Japan with South Korea, but only with very limited capabilities, although technically under international law, they are actually combatants in the war and therefore possible targets for the Iranians. But the targeting here is clearly restricting the supply of oil through Hormuz and requesting payment for allowing ships to go through. So now that payment needs to be made in yuan. And Japan yesterday, I think, has agreed to do that. And I think other countries will agree to do that. And it only makes sense because actually the Strait of Hormuz is the only narrow strait that does not charge for shipment. Malacca Strait, Panama Strait, and all sorts of other canals and routes across the world all charge. Suez, they all charge, and they charge quite a lot of money. $500,000, even $1 million for these sorts of things. And so for Hormuz in this time, the Iranians are asking for $2 million for these big container ships, big oil ships. It seems a little excessive, but I think that at the end they should be able to do that. If everybody else does it, why can't they? And then they'll guarantee the security, and that seems very normal for me. And why shouldn't they? And they can do it with their friends. Now, the other thing that I didn't mention in yesterday's talk was about the possibility here that the BRICS are going to become involved. Because what we need to remember here is, so basically the Americans, so Trump's taco has essentially started to open an empty space. There's a black hole, a vacuum starting to appear in the Middle East. Now, Trump has ordered another 3,500 expeditionary force to go to the Gulf. More ships, more tanks, more aircraft, more landing craft, all sorts of things. So they're preparing for some kind of ground operation, but very limited, as I said yesterday. It's got to be done from an island or from the sea. And how far in can they go? Maybe 100 Ks, 200 Ks. I mean, obviously with air power they can go further, but troops on the ground, that's highly unlikely. And what's going to happen, of course, is that those any troops that get on the ground are going to be subject to all sorts of aggression, or not aggression, but defense, if you like, from Iranians, who are well trained and have weapons, and they're on home turf, and I just don't think the Americans are going to do very well. No, I really believe that these troops are specifically being set up to try and get their hands on the nuclear material, on the enriched uranium. I think this is the goal, is to get hold of that, if they can, through some special operation, ground operation, en masse ground operation. And from there they will try and do what they did in Syria, which was, they took control of the northern area of Syria. They used the Kurds to do that, and that took control of Syrian oil and Syrian agriculture. And of course the regime then was hamstrung. If you don't have any income, no food. The agricultural area of Syria was the richest, and that's where all their oil came from. So then the government was cut off from that. Well, that was the end of Syria, basically. It took another year, or in 2 years. But here in Iran, this looks like a possibility as well. Now, that brings me back to the BRICS. Now, if that is unsuccessful, if they're not able to do this, and even if they were able to do this, they still have to get out. Highly unlikely that they will be able to hold territory within Iran's actual sovereign borders. I just think this is going to be very difficult to do, and could end up in a mass capture or even killing of American troops if they try to do this. I think it's very unwise. But anyway, the point here is that what I think is going to happen is that there will end up being some kind of a power vacuum in the Gulf area, because nobody other than the Americans can even think about guaranteeing the entire security, like being the policeman for the area. Israel is not capable of doing that. They're capable of extending, projecting power, but they're not going to be able to do much more than that unless somebody else is involved, so the Europeans or the Americans, NATO. So I don't think that's going to happen either. So what we're seeing here is that there's going to be an opening. It already happened, I think. It's an opening of a small vacuum, which may get bigger as it becomes obvious that Iran is going to be able to hold onto its sovereignty and exercise, project power out into Hormuz and other places. And so when that happens, what's going to fill the vacuum? And the answer is the BRICS. And I think it's already started. I think there are already some Iran and India talking to each other about this, and I'm pretty sure that the other BRICS countries are going to be discussing this. Now, if you think about the map, you look at the map of the Middle East, West Asia, and what you discover is that the Red Sea and the whole area is basically being embraced by BRICS. You have Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Ethiopia, Russia, and that basically is an embrace of the Red Sea. And I think there is a real possibility of coming up with a format through the BRICS to be able to offer, to guarantee some kind of security. And if not for everybody, then definitely for themselves. And Iran would be interested in that, to do it inside the BRICS formula. That would work for the Saudis, would work for the Ethiopians, it would work for the Egyptians, because they're also in it. And so perhaps Israel could come to some kind of an agreement, although they won't like it, but it seems to make sense. I mean, it was supported by the Europeans, and they have, they have access here as well, and the Mediterranean. So that's also possible. And then the Americans. The Americans may not like it, but if they have to withdraw in any way, or, it really is I think, a lessening of their power in the region, power projection, then that would give the possibility for the BRICS to actually start providing an element of security for the Red Sea, for the Hormuz, for the Strait of Hormuz, Eastern Mediterranean, and then going up into the Black Sea. So this could be a BRICS safety zone, or we might call it some kind of a multilateral framework just for the Red Sea and Hormuz and the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's, I think, is a functional idea. the same idea could work very well for the South China Sea, because you've got the BRICS working there with Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. That could also work. So I see that Australia, is it would be a very good opportunity for Australia. But anyway, right now they're going to follow the Americans, and they're technically at war now with Iran because they've supplied military equipment. So, I don't know, 100 personnel or something like that. But it's a technicality. I don't think they're really going to put boots on the ground or anything. But and one reconnaissance aircraft does not a war make. But you can see that the idea here is that if this BRICS thing could work out, and it is possible now, India, Russia, China, these are the big three that we really need to think about. But, it's good for Brazil. Now, one of the things that everybody seems to forget when they think about BRICS is that, when America says it wants to dominate the Western Hemisphere, and it wants to be partners with Australia, and it wants to be partners with Ukraine, partners with South Africa, these are all exporters, Argentina. These are all exporters of the same commodities that the Americans export. In fact, they are commodity competitors. And so while the Americans say, it's about the liberal order and their regional hegemony, at the same time, they want to restrict the trade of those countries because it affects the trade and export trade for the Americans. So it's very much a double-edged sword here for everybody, because the Americans want it both ways. So they're allowing a certain amount of liberal exchange, laissez-faire exchange, if you like, but at the end of the day, they will try to diminish the capability of those other countries, mostly BRICS countries, from exporting too much, because it is negative, will have a negative aspect, consequences for the Americans. So the Americans are in a sort of a bind here if the BRICS start to get together, and for me that looks like the very best choice, actually. And I think that Europe really needs to reconsider this whole thing as well, after their last 2 years with Trump. So that's where we've gone to. He's back down. They're sending 3,500 new expeditionary troops, aircraft, more helicopter transport ship, transport logistics, tanks, launchers, interceptors, all sorts of things. So something is going to happen on the ground. And the most obvious, everybody's going to talk about Karg, but this is going to be so hard to hold. I think that's almost impossible, drones and missiles. So I think it's going to be an attempt to get hold of this material. And they might even try and negotiate to get this material as part of the deal. But it does seems to me that Iran can't do that. I think Iran is in a situation where it cannot give up its nuclear material. It cannot give up its ballistic missile technology. Now, this is an interesting thing that we haven't thought about before, or not many people have mentioned. I don't think anybody's mentioned this, that actually, in terms of missile technology, and hypersonics, and guidance systems for those, the Americans could learn a lot from getting hold of the Iranian technology, and so could the Israelis. That's something that needs to be thought about as well, that security. And look, my feeling is that this, although Trump's given a 5-day window here, there's nothing in there for the Iranians. They're not going to give up the technology, they're not going to give up the uranium, they're not going to give up control of Hormuz, because then they lose all their leverage. Why would they do it? It just doesn't make any sense. So I don't know how they're going to do the deal, but yes, look, if they just charge people to go through Hormuz, that's fine. And if they deny that to the Americans, that's also fine, because the Americans, as Trump said, don't really need it, and they've never really needed it. And so then I think if the Saudis, UAE is also part of BRICS, so there you are. There's the complete grouping. I forgot to mention that. So it's Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Egypt, UAE, Turkey, Russia, Iran. It's a very good configuration. Whether it was intentionally designed this way is something else altogether. I'm not going to talk about that yet. But I think that is a real possibility. And then, as I also mentioned yesterday in the podcast, Mark Carney, the Canadian, and his attempts, his travels around the world and speeches at the Munich Security Conference regarding the building of a liberal bloc, a middle power liberal bloc, which is basically the European countries, Australia, Japan, Korea, Canada, and a few others, is an attempt to offset the power of BRICS and to balance and hedge against the US and China. But at the same time, it also looks very much like it's building on the CPTPP, and Carney has said so. It also looks like the American-led grouping for Indo-Pacific critical minerals grouping, which Thailand has just said they want to join. I think it's called the PIRPI. And this is an attempt to now control the supply chains of critical minerals. And what we talked about yesterday, and what I'll reconfirm for everybody, of course, is that the Americans are trying to take hold of the global oil market again. I mean, this is kind of a fundamental. They're the largest producer. They're a very large exporter, also a large importer. They have lots of refineries, although one of them's on fire. I just read a news report 10 minutes ago saying one of them was on fire. I asked myself if Venezuelans or Cubans who were unhappy, or even an Iranian, but I imagine it might be a Cuban or a Venezuelan, set fire to it. But it's pure speculation. I have no idea. But a lot of people are upset and would like to get rid of those refineries in the Gulf of Mexico, which, the Gulf of America, haha. So, by having influence over the stockpiles of Venezuelan oil, and then getting hold of Hormuz and Iranian oil, or being able to have effective control over it, and then having effective control over Hormuz, which means all of the UAE, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, the natural gas, the oil, etc., they would dominate the global oil market, and then they would start to manipulate the price for their own benefits, and for, obviously, to injure Russia and all of their adversaries, so Iran, Russia, China, the obvious targets, right? Or anybody else that displeases them. So I think that's where it's all going. Taco Tuesday, Trump's back down again. We've got 5 more days to figure it out. He's got 5 days to come up with something better. I don't see any reason why the Iranians should give them anything at all. It's all on the Americans. They're the ones that started it. It's their aggression, the Israeli aggression. Why should the Iranians have anything to do with that? And then one also has to remember that the Iranian population is not only very young, but they're also very well educated, and they have advanced manufacturing, advanced technologies, and advanced systems. And the more pressure that's put on them by the G7, but most specifically Israel and America, the more that China and Russia are going to help Iran. And I think at the end, it's in India's benefit to do so as well, and even Pakistan's benefit to do so as well. So building, terrestrial land routes to offset US maritime power and G7 maritime power is clearly the way to go. Or Arctic also is another way. So that's where we're going to be going, and we'll talk about that again next week. So I'm glad to give you an update. If you want to check it out, see the link below to go to yesterday's podcast, and I'll talk to you all tomorrow. Probably I think I'm going to have a look at Southeast Asia tomorrow. So then we'll put that through the ASEAN Chair Substack and podcast. Anyway, good. I hope you're all well. Taco Tuesday.